Did you know that it's been 134 days since a Genesis game was added to the Nintendo Switch Online service? Thankfully, that drought ends today with 3 classic 16-bit games straight from Sega's vault, including the shoot-'em-up sequel Super Thunderblade, the action-packed ESWAT City Under Siege, and the seminal 2-player beat-'em-up Streets of Rage. Yeah, that's exciting news, but are any of these games actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Machines Sega, Mega Play, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Get ready, because it's going to be another love it or hate it episode of the Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew.
最近ゲームがつまらない、はまらない、そんな噂が飛び交ってるけど、それはソフトのせいじゃない。ハードに限界があったからだ。セガメガドライブ16ビット CPU 搭載。限界のバリアをぶち破って見せる、迫る、うなる。ビジュアルショック、スピードショック、サウンドショック。
時代が求めた16ビットセガメガドライブ。
Landing somewhere between Narc and RoboCop is ESWAT City Under Siege, the 1990 action game starring Duke Oda, a beat cop who spends 7 stages slowly becoming a heavily armored killing machine. Now, if all this sounds vaguely familiar, it might be because this is a loose adaptation of Cyber Police ESWAT, an action game that hit arcades just 1 year earlier. That was basically a futuristic take on Sega's classic game Shinobi, and while this Genesis spin-off still has echoes of the arcade hit, it has different levels, and weapons, and even bosses. This is one of those Sega games that shows up in pretty much every Genesis collection, whether you like it or not. Let's go ahead and see where the critics landed. You know what? We might as well start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who is actually on the low end of the scale this time around. In their 1991 video game buyer's guide, of all places, EGM gave ESWAT an average score of 7.5 out of 10. That may not sound too bad, but it doesn't really tell the full story. You see, this is one of those examples where everybody's on the same page except for one editor. For example, Martin gave the action game a 7 out of 10, arguing that ESWAT isn't bad, but it isn't a very intense or spectacular game either. The graphics and music are adequate, but the game plays way too slow for me. Controls are awkward, and the power-ups are lame. Sushi X, on the other hand, strongly disagreed, giving it a 9. Strap on your weapon, pin on your badge, and go get 'em! Non-stop action as a futuristic law enforcer in a city gone berserk. Great action, including an evolving mobile suit and flight pack, makes things interesting. No Batman? Get this one! Now, when it comes to the lower scores, we could talk about Raze, who gave it a 72%, or maybe we could talk about Mega Play, who rounded down, giving the game a 7 out of 10. But look, those aren't even worth our time, because the only score worth talking about comes from GameZone, who gave ESWAT a score of, get this, 1 out of 6. Highly unoriginal beat-em-up that looks as dated as a very old thing. No plot, just a fair workout for your trigger finger. Now hang on, it looks as dated as a very old thing? Yep, you definitely nailed it, Mr. Professional Writer. Alright, now that we've got the outliers out of the way, let's go ahead and start our ascent up the review scale. Sega Power ended up giving ESWAT a score of 78%, only 3 points higher than EGM. The Games Machine went a couple of ticks better, going with an 80%. And then there's Machines Sega and their 87%. Now, we could talk about the 89% found in Sega Pro, but I'd rather check in with Ace and their ridiculous 1,000 point scale, giving the action game a score of 895. Ace concluded that ESWAT is a bang-up-to-date arcade game and its Mega Drive implementation is kissing close to the coin-op original. Although ESWAT is based around a fairly simple game design, the gameplay is sufficiently varied and challenging to keep you going until you've beaten the last of the 6 crime bosses. That's likely to take a long time to do. As we continue on, we have video games and computer entertainment going as high as a 9 out of 10, making it one of their best reviewed games of 1990. Machines Sega liked it even more than their flagship publication, going as high as a 92%. That's the same score that we saw from Mega Play in their first issue. But if you're looking for the highest score, then look no further than Computer and Video Games, who went all the way up to a 93%. Basically, ESWAT is Super Shinobi with all sorts of mega guns and hulking great suits of cyber armor. But even though it's not very original, it's one hell of a game. The sprites and backdrops are excellent, with brilliant parallax scrolling scenery and all manner of beautifully animated baddies to blow into oblivion. The difficulty level is nicely balanced to draw you into the game, and it doesn't take long to get to level 4. But from there, things get pretty tough, and it takes quite some practice to crack the remaining 4 levels. And even if you get through the game, there are further 3 difficulty levels to challenge you, adding extra lasting appeal. If you're after a slick and highly playable arcade game, ESWAT is the one to go for. You know, for me, ESWAT has never really clicked. I love some of the ideas, and I think the world building is pretty cool. But I largely agree with EGM on this one. And don't get me wrong, Game Zone is crazy, so don't lump me in with those haters. But even with that outlier dragging the score down, the overall average still remains a pretty good 79%. With so many outlets praising the game, you might as well give it a shot. I may not love it, but you might. When the Genesis launched in 1989, Sega knew that they had one ace card up their sleeve, and that was their treasure trove of hugely popular arcade games. This strategy was obvious in the early days when the system launched with high-profile ports of arcade games like Altered Beast, Space Harrier 2, and of course Sega's critically acclaimed version of Ghouls and Ghosts. Now, 36 years later, I wouldn't blame you if you lumped Super Thunderblade in with that list of arcade ports, but it's not. Instead, it's actually a console sequel to the 1987 arcade game Thunderblade, showing everybody that the Genesis could do more than just ports. But did that translate to high marks from the critics? Let's find out. We're going to once again start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who ended up giving Super Thunderblade an average score of 6 out of 10. To put that score in perspective, the shooter ended up being EGM's worst reviewed Genesis launch game. When Steve reviewed it, he gave it a 5 out of 10, arguing that Super Thunderblade just isn't what a 16-bit game should be. It's not offending, but the graphics, while detailed, don't move in smooth progression from the background to the foreground. The worst thing about Super Thunderblade, however, is how it controls, with poor response that is slow and sluggish and makes the game tedious. Jim strongly disagreed, raving about the awesome graphics. Harder than the arcade or 8-bit versions of Thunderblade, but also a lot better. The controls are sluggish, but the graphics more than make up for any minor problem in play. Super Thunderblade makes the 8-bit Thunderblade look like a 2600 game. Now, if you think that EGM 6 out of 10 is a bad score, then buckle up, because let me tell you, this is going to be a bumpy ride. The next step down is Machines Sega, who ended up giving the shooter a suboptimal score of 49%. And hey, as long as we're free-falling, we might as well smack right into Sega Force, who went with a 37%. Unfortunately, the scenario and artillery is the only slightly impressive thing about this sham of a game. The 3D effect is diabolical, and the action so tedious that you'd get more enjoyment reading a copy of certain other Sega mags. Quite why anybody would want this is too mind-numbing to contemplate. Avoid like the plague. That's harsh, but that's nothing compared to the reigning champ of low scores. Let's go ahead and quickly check in with GameZone, who once again gave this Genesis game a score of 1 out of 6. Ancient game with loads of really blocky 3D graphics. Sadly, it's looking its considerable age. For what it's worth, there are actually a few magazines that liked Super Thunder Blade. Ray's ended up giving the game a solid 75% in their 3rd issue, while Sega Pro went as high as an 83% in issue 6. The highest score comes from Ace, and not just because of their ridiculous 1,000 point scale. Giving it a staggering score of 880, Ace concluded that it captures for the first time all the speed and enjoyment of the arcade original as you take to the skies in your attack chopper. Once again, play it loud. Hey, wait a second, that was Nintendo's slogan. Genesis owners should be playing to the next level, where I guess they'll be welcomed. But maybe not if they're playing Super Thunder Blade, because this game just isn't great. Yes, Ace and Sega Pro liked it, but don't buy into the hype. This game was bad then, and it's even worse now. The Genesis just wasn't very good at this type of 3D shooter. As a result, Super Thunder Blade earned a low overall average of only 59%. Not good.
The Sega Genesis Mega Hits are here, and you can get one free. Check it out. Slam Dunk and Pat Riley basketball, Arcade Blockbuster Super Monaco GP, All-Pro Joe Montana football, the Ultimate Puzzle Game Columns, or James Buster Douglas Knockout Boxing. Your choice. Free.
That's a great deal.
Pick one when you buy a Sega Genesis system between now and October 31st, up to a $50 value. Free. So buy a Genesis system now and get an extra game free. Hey, you can't do that on Nintendo.
Going into 1991, there were 2 unspoken truths that pretty much everybody agreed on. The first was that the Super Nintendo was going to come in and once again dominate, thanks in large part to the pack-in game Super Mario World. At the exact same time, many people believed that Final Fight would continue Capcom's winning streak and be the year's top beat-em-up. But that's not how things turned out. When the critics ended up getting their hands on the Super NES port of Final Fight, they complained about the missing levels, the missing enemies, the missing hero, and of course, the missing 2-player support. They concluded that it was a fun game, but a disappointing port. This left the door open for Sega, who burst into that room with not only the best brawler of the year, but also one of the best Genesis games of all time. While not as pretty as Final Fight, Streets of Rage delivered more levels, more enemies, more heroes, and yes, full 2-player support. Yeah, it was a big deal. Now, as you might expect, everybody loves Streets of Rage. In fact, the lowest score I could find is also the highest. No, really. Of course, that's because the lowest score comes from Ace, who gave Streets of Rage a massive score of 885 out of 1,000. Exceptionally easy to pick up and play due to the instinctiveness of the control method. Streets of Rage features some of the finest music to ever grace the Mega Drive, with a high-quality title, theme, and a tune for each level, ranging from New Jack City-style rap beats to samba to steel drum combos. Graphically, it could have packed more of a punch, but that doesn't detract from the action, and there's enough mate-impressing stuff here to sustain anybody's street cred for a good few weeks. Of course, Ace was the outlier here, as every other magazine gave Streets of Rage a 90% or higher. This is where we see a bit of a traffic jam amongst the critics, with Mean Machine giving the game a nice round percentage of 90%, while Mega Play went with a 9 out of 10. Now that's the exact same score that we saw from Electronic Gaming Monthly, who ended up reviewing Streets of Rage in the exact same issue, in fact on the same exact page as Final Fight. I think Fake Ninja Sushi X sums up the feud perfectly. Final Fight, move over! This is the type of fighting game I've been waiting for since Fighting Street. 2 players, 40 attacks, 8 levels, large bosses, and music that rivals Sonic the Hedgehog. Streets of Rage is the best fighting game around. Even Martin had to give it up for Streets of Rage. Fighting games are not my cup of tea, but this cart totally blew me away from beginning to end. The gameplay is so good that it puts all other fighting games, including Final Fight, to shame. Tons of moves, and the best thing about it is the 2-player mode. Funkadelic music, dude! Now, as we climb the review scale, we see Sega Power go one tick higher, giving the brawler a 91%. Megaplay went one step better, giving it a 92%. And then there's Computer and Video Games, who went with, you guessed it, a score of 93%. Frank O'Connor loved the game, going as far as to admit something kind of embarrassing. I almost wet myself and called the police when I first plugged in the Streets of Rage cart. The game starts up with a stupendous opening sequence and a great house remix of some fabulous Oriental music. From here on, things just get better and better. The graphics are gorgeous, the sprites beautifully animated and full of life. The backgrounds on certain sections are almost photographic in quality and portray a city full of disease, squalor, and ninja death squads. If fast, mindless, pointless violence is your cup of tea, then get a hold of Streets of Rage and have those Famicom owners wishing that they never upgraded. Here's the game that actually makes the Fammy look a bit feeble, and that's saying something. If you're looking for even higher scores, then don't worry, I got you covered. Sega Pro went all the way up to a 96%. GameZone actually gave the game a score of 5, which would normally be a perfect mark, but you gotta remember that GameZone actually goes one step beyond the 5-star rating, giving the best of the best a Megazone rating. GamePro, on the other hand, wasn't afraid to give Streets of Rage a perfect score. Giving it a 5 out of 5, they concluded that Streets of Rage will knock you out. If you enjoy games like Double Dragon or Final Fight, you must slug it out with Streets of Rage. Look, this is a perfect example of a game coming out at the perfect time. When Final Fight let everybody down, Sega really stepped in, stealing a lot of the Super Nintendo's thunder. And it wasn't a fluke either, because Streets of Rage has remained one of Sega's most beloved games. Which is why you aren't even remotely surprised when I tell you that the overall average score is 93%. That is the exact same average as Streets of Rage 2. Oh man, here's hoping that it won't take another 4 years to get Streets of Rage 3 on the service.
セガメガドライブの16ビットソフトシリーズが面白さぶっちぎりでドッカンとデビュー。まずは10号機、そしてスペースハリアー2。やっぱゲームは16ビット。よ本ボール。セガ。
Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you'll be happy to know that we post episodes just like this one every time classic games get added to modern consoles. We have a whole playlist full of these reviews. Now, here's the question I have for you. If you could add one more Sega console to the Nintendo Switch Online, what would it be? I assume most of the votes are going to go with either the Saturn or the Dreamcast. It's really hard to argue with those. They're great choices. But I kind of want to see the Sega CD and 32X find their way to the service. Of course, I also want the Saturn and the Dreamcast, but I don't know, I just want everything. Let me see your picks in the comments below. Now, here's a fun fact. I had a whole other review crew episode ready to go. But you know what? I had to scrap it because of these Genesis reviews. Look for that full motion video related review crew episode to go up early next week. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,